c. The 11th of June 1572 circa. The 16th of August 1637 was an English playwright and poet. Jonson's artistry exerted a lasting influence upon English poetry and stage comedy. He popularized the comedy of humors. He is best known for the satirical plays Every Man in His Humor 1598 Volpone, or The Fox c. 1606 The Alchemist 1610 and Bartholomew Fair 1614 and for his lyric and epigrammatic poetry. He is generally regarded as the second most important English dramatist, after William Shakespeare, during the reign of James I. Jonson was a classically educated, well-read and cultured man of the English Renaissance with an appetite for controversy, personal and political, artistic and intellectual, whose cultural influence was of unparalleled breadth upon the playwrights and the poets of the Jacobean era 1603-1625 and of the Caroline era 1625-1642. In midlife, Jonson said his paternal grandfather, who served King Henry VIII and was a gentleman, was a member of the extended Johnston family of Annandale in the Dumfries and Galloway, a genealogy that is attested by the 3 spindles rhombi in the Johnson family coat of arms. One spindle is a diamond-shaped heraldic device used by the Johnston family. His ancestors spelled the family name with a letter T, Johnston or Johnston. While the spelling had eventually changed to the more common Johnson, the playwright's own particular preference became Johnson. Jonson's father lost his property, was imprisoned, and, as a Protestant, suffered forfeiture under Queen Mary. Becoming a clergyman upon his release, he died a month before his son's birth. 7. His widow married a master bricklayer 2 years later. Jonson attended school in St. Martin's Lane in London. Later, a family friend paid for his studies at Westminster School, where the antiquarian, historian, topographer and officer of arms William Camden 1551-1623 was one of his masters. The pupil and master became friends, and the intellectual influence of Camden's broad-ranging scholarship upon Jonson's art and literary style remained notable, until Camden's death in 1623. On leaving Westminster School in 1589, Jonson was to have attended the University of Cambridge, to continue his book learning but did not, because of his unwilled apprenticeship to his bricklayer stepfather. 5-9 According to the churchman and historian Thomas Fuller, 1608-61, Jonson at this time built a garden wall in Lincoln's Inn. After having been an apprentice bricklayer, Jonson went to the Netherlands and volunteered to soldier with the English regiments of Sir Francis Vere 1560-1609 in Flanders. England was allied with the Dutch in their fight for independence as well as the ongoing war with Spain. The Hawthornden manuscripts 1619 of the conversations between Ben Jonson and the poet William Drummond of Hawthornden 1585-1649 report that, when in Flanders, Jonson engaged, fought and killed an enemy soldier in single combat, and took for trophies the weapons of the vanquished soldier. After his military activity on the continent, Jonson returned to England and worked as an actor and as a playwright. As an actor, he was the protagonist, Geronimo, in the play The Spanish Tragedy, circa 1586 by Thomas Kyd 1558-94, the first revenge tragedy in English literature. By 1597, he was a working playwright employed by Philip Henslowe, the leading producer for the English Public Theatre. By the next year, the production of Every Man in His Humor 1598 had established Jonson's reputation as a dramatist. Jonson described his wife to William Drummond as a shrew, yet honest. The identity of Jonson's wife is obscure, though she sometimes is identified as Anne Lewis, the woman who married a Benjamin Jonson in 1594, at the Church of St. Magnus the Martyr, near London Bridge. The registers of St. Martin in the Fields record that Mary Jonson, their eldest daughter, died in November 1593, at 6 months of age. A decade later, in 1603, Benjamin Jonson, their eldest son, died of bubonic plague when he was 7 years old, upon which Jonson wrote the elegiac, On My First Zana, 1603. A second son, also named Benjamin Jonson, died in 1635. During that period clarification needed. Jonson and his wife lived separate lives for 5 years. Jonson enjoyed the residential hospitality of his patrons, Esme Stuart, 3rd Duke of Lennox and 7th Seigneur d'Aubigny and Sir Robert Townsend. It proved popular and went through several editions. Jonson's other work for the theatre in the last years of Elizabeth I's reign was marked by fighting and controversy. Cynthia's Revels was produced by the children of the Chapel Royal at Blackfriars Theatre in 1600. It satirized both John Marston, who Johnson believed had accused him of lustfulness in Histriomastics, and Thomas Dekker. Johnson attacked the two poets again in Poetaster, 1601. Dekker responded with Satyromastics, subtitled, The Untrussing of the Humorous Poet. The final scene of this play, whilst certainly not to be taken at face value as a portrait of Johnson, offers a caricature that is recognizable from Drummond's report boasting about himself and condemning other poets, criticizing performances of his plays and calling attention to himself in any available way. This War of the Theatres appears to have ended with reconciliation on all sides. Johnson collaborated with Dekker on a pageant welcoming James I to England in 1603, although Drummond reports that Johnson called Dekker a rogue. Marston dedicated The Malcontent to Johnson, and the two collaborated with Chapman on Eastward Ho, a 1605 play whose anti-Scottish sentiment briefly landed both Johnson and Chapman in jail. Apart from two tragedies, Sejanus and Catiline, that largely failed to impress Renaissance audiences, Johnson's work for the public theatres was in comedy. These plays vary in some respects. The minor early plays, particularly those written for boy players, present somewhat looser plots and less developed characters than those written later, for adult companies. Already in the plays which were his salvos in the Poets' War, he displays the keen eye for absurdity and hypocrisy that marks his best-known plays. In these early efforts, however, plot mostly takes second place to variety of incident and comic set pieces. They are, also, notably ill-tempered. Thomas Davies called Poetaster a contemptible mixture of the serio-comic, where the names of Augustus Caesar, Maecenas, Virgil, Horace, Ovid and Tibullus are all sacrificed upon the altar of private resentment. Another early comedy in a different vein, The Case is Altered, is markedly similar to Shakespeare's romantic comedies in its foreign setting, emphasis on genial wit and love plot. Henslow's diary indicates that Johnson had a hand in numerous other plays, including many in genres such as English history with which he is not otherwise associated. The comedies of his middle career, From Eastward Ho to The Devil is an Ass, are for the most part city comedy, with a London setting, themes of trickery and money, and a distinct moral ambiguity, despite Johnson's professed aim in the prologue to Volpone to mix profit with your pleasure. His late plays or dotages, particularly The Magnetic Lady and The Sad Shepherd Wickedata, exhibit signs of an accommodation with the romantic tendencies of Elizabethan comedy. Within this general progression, however, Johnson's comic style remained constant and easily recognizable. He announces his program in the prologue to the folio version of Every Man in His Humor. He promises to represent deeds and language such as men do use. He planned to write comedies that revived the classical premises of Elizabethan dramatic theory, or rather, since all but the loosest English comedies could claim some descent from Plautus and Terence, he intended to apply those premises with rigor. 46. This commitment entailed negations. After The Case is Altered, Johnson eschewed distant locations, noble characters, romantic plots and other staples of Elizabethan comedy, focusing instead on the satiric and realistic inheritance of new comedy. He set his plays in contemporary settings, peopled them with recognizable types, and set them to actions that, if not strictly realistic, involved everyday motives such as greed and jealousy. In accordance with the temper of his age, he was often so broad in his characterization that many of his most famous scenes border on the farcical, as William Congreve, for example, judged Epicone. He was more diligent in adhering to the classical unities than many of his peers, although as Margaret Cavendish noted, the unity of action in the major comedies was rather compromised by Johnson's abundance of incident. To this classical model Johnson applied the two features of his style which save his classical imitations from mere pedantry: the vividness with which he depicted the lives of his characters and the intricacy of his plots. Coleridge, for instance, claimed that The Alchemist had one of the three most perfect plots in literature. Johnson's poetry, like his drama, is informed by his classical learning. Some of his better-known poems are close translations of Greek or Roman models. All display the careful attention to form and style that often came naturally to those trained in classics in the humanist manner. Johnson largely avoided the debates about rhyme and meter that had consumed Elizabethan classicists such as Thomas Campion and Gabriel Harvey. Accepting both rhyme and stress, Johnson used them to mimic the classical qualities of simplicity, restraint and precision. Epigrams, published in the 1616 folio, is an entry in a genre that was popular among Lady Elizabethan and Jacobean audiences, although Johnson was perhaps the only poet of his time to work in its full classical range. The epigrams explore various attitudes, most from the satiric stock of the day. Complaints against women, courtiers and spies abound. The condemnatory poems are short and anonymous. Johnson's epigrams of praise, including a famous poem to Camden and lines to Lucy Harrington, are longer and are mostly addressed to specific individuals. Although it is included among the epigrams, On My First Zana, is neither satirical nor very short. The poem, intensely personal and deeply felt, typifies a genre that would come to be called lyric poetry. It is possible that the spelling of son, as zana, is meant to allude to the sonnet form, with which it shares some features. A few other so-called epigrams share this quality. Johnson's poems of The Forest also appeared in the first folio. Most of the 15 poems are addressed to Johnson's aristocratic supporters, but the most famous are his country house poem, To Penshurst, and the poem, To Celia, Come, My Celia, Let Us Prove, that appears also in Volpone. Underwood, published in the expanded folio of 1640, is a larger and more heterogeneous group of poems. It contains a celebration of Caris, Johnson's most extended effort at love poetry, various religious pieces, encomiastic poems including the poem to Shakespeare and a sonnet on Mary Roth, the execration against Vulcan and others. The 1640 volume also contains 3 elegies which have often been ascribed to Donne. One of them appeared in Donne's posthumous collected poems. There are many legends about Johnson's rivalry with Shakespeare. William Drummond reports that during their conversation, Johnson scoffed at 2 apparent absurdities in Shakespeare's plays, a nonsensical line in Julius Caesar and the setting of the Winter's Tale on the non-existent seacoast of Bohemia. Drummond also reported Johnson as saying that Shakespeare wanted art, i.e., lacked skill. In De Shakespeare Nostrat, in Timber, which was published posthumously and reflects his lifetime of practical experience, Johnson offers a fuller and more conciliatory comment. He recalls being told by certain actors that Shakespeare never blotted, i.e., crossed out a line when he wrote. His own claimed response was, would he had blotted 1,000? However, Johnson explains, he was, indeed, honest and of an open and free nature, had an excellent fantasy, brave notions and gentle expressions, wherein he flowed with that facility that sometimes it was necessary he should be stopped. 49 Johnson concludes that, there was ever more in him to be praised than to be pardoned. When Shakespeare died, he said, he was not of an age, but for all time. Thomas Fuller relates stories of Johnson and Shakespeare engaging in debates in the Mermaid Tavern. Fuller imagines conversations in which Shakespeare would run rings around the more learned but more ponderous Johnson. That the 2 men knew each other personally is beyond doubt, not only because of the tone of Johnson's references to him but because Shakespeare's company produced a number of Johnson's plays, at least 2 of which Every Man in His Humor and Sejanus His Fault Shakespeare certainly acted in. However, it is now impossible to tell how much personal communication they had, and tales of their friendship cannot be substantiated. Johnson's most influential and revealing commentary on Shakespeare is the second of the 2 poems that he contributed to the prefatory verse that opens Shakespeare's first folio. This poem, To the Memory of My Beloved the Author, Mr. William Shakespeare and What He Hath Left Us, did a good deal to create the traditional view of Shakespeare as a poet who, despite small Latin and less Greek, 51, had a natural genius. The poem has traditionally been thought to exemplify the contrast which Johnson perceived between himself, the disciplined and erudite classicist, scornful of ignorance and skeptical of the masses, and Shakespeare, represented in the poem as a kind of natural wonder whose genius was not subject to any rules except those of the audiences for which he wrote. But the poem itself qualifies this view. Yet must I not give nature all, thy art? My gentle Shakespeare, must enjoy a part. Some view this elegy as a conventional exercise, but others see it as a heartfelt tribute to the sweet swan of Avon, the soul of the age. It has been argued that Johnson helped to edit the first folio, and he may have been inspired to write this poem by reading his fellow playwrights' works, a number of which had been previously either unpublished or available in less satisfactory versions in a relatively complete form. Johnson was a towering literary figure, and his influence was enormous, for he has been described as one of the most vigorous minds that ever added to the strength of English literature. Before the English Civil War, the tribe of Ben touted his importance, and during the Restoration Jonson's satirical comedies and his theory and practice of humor characters, which are often misunderstood, see William Congreve's Letters for Clarification, was extremely influential, providing the blueprint for many Restoration comedies. John Aubrey wrote of Jonson in Brief Lives. By 1700 Jonson's status began to decline. In the Romantic era, Jonson suffered the fate of being unfairly compared and contrasted to Shakespeare, as the taste for Jonson's type of satirical comedy decreased. Jonson was at times greatly appreciated by the Romantics, but overall he was denigrated for not writing in a Shakespearean vein. In 2012, after more than 2 decades of research, Cambridge University Press published the first new edition of Jonson's complete works for 60 years. As G. E. Bentley notes in Shakespeare and Jonson, their reputations in the 17th century compared, Jonson's reputation was in some respects equal to Shakespeare's in the 17th century. After the English theatres were reopened on the restoration of Charles II, Jonson's work, along with Shakespeare's and Fletcher's, formed the initial core of the Restoration repertory. It was not until after 1710 that Shakespeare's plays, ordinarily in heavily revised forms, were more frequently performed than those of his Renaissance contemporaries. Many critics since the 18th century have ranked Jonson below only Shakespeare among English Renaissance dramatists. Critical judgment has tended to emphasize the very qualities that Jonson himself lauds in his prefaces, in Timber, and in his scattered prefaces and dedications: the realism and propriety of his language, the bite of his satire, and the care with which he plotted his comedies. For some critics, the temptation to contrast Jonson representing art or craft with Shakespeare representing nature, or untutored genius, has seemed natural. Jonson himself may be said to have initiated this interpretation in the Second Folio, and Samuel Butler drew the same comparison in his commonplace book later in the century. At the Restoration, this sensed difference became a kind of critical dogma. Charles de Saint-Evremond placed Jonson's comedies above all else in English drama, and Charles Gildon called Jonson the father of English comedy. John Dryden offered a more common assessment in the Essay of Dramatic Poesy, in which his avatar Neander compares Shakespeare to Homer and Jonson to Virgil. The former represented profound creativity, the latter polished artifice. But artifice was in the 17th century almost synonymous with art. Jonson, for instance, used artificer as a synonym for artist. Discoveries 33. For Louis Theobald, too, Jonson out-ed all his excellence to his art, in contrast to Shakespeare, the natural genius. Nicholas Rowe, to whom betraceth legend that Jonson owed the production of Every Man in his humor to Shakespeare's intercession, likewise attributed Jonson's excellence to learning, which did not raise him quite to the level of genius. A consensus formed: Jonson was the first English poet to understand classical precepts with any accuracy, and he was the first to apply those precepts successfully to contemporary life. But there were also more negative spins on Jonson's learned art. For instance, in the 1750s, Edward Young casually remarked on the way in which Jonson's learning worked, like Samson's strength, to his own detriment. Earlier, Aphra Behn, writing in defense of female playwrights, had pointed to Jonson as a writer whose learning did not make him popular. Unsurprisingly, she compares him unfavorably to Shakespeare. Particularly in the tragedies, with their lengthy speeches abstracted from Sallust and Cicero, Augustan critics saw a writer whose learning had swamped his aesthetic judgment. Jonson's status, if it also sharpened their awareness of the difference traditionally noted between Jonson and Shakespeare. This trend was by no means universal. However, William Gifford, Jonson's first editor of the 19th century, did a great deal to defend Jonson's reputation during this period of general decline. In the next era, Swinburne, who was more interested in Jonson than most Victorians, wrote, "The flowers of his growing have every quality but one which belongs to the rarest and finest among flowers. They have color, form, variety, fertility, vigor. The one thing they want is fragrance." By fragrance, Swinburne means spontaneity. In the 20th century, Jonson's body of work has been subject to a more varied set of analyses, broadly consistent with the interests and programs of modern literary criticism. In an essay printed in The Sacred Wood, T.S. Eliot attempted to repudiate the charge that Jonson was an arid classicist by analyzing the role of imagination in his dialogue. Eliot was appreciative of Jonson's overall conception and his surface, a view consonant with the modernist reaction against romantic criticism, which tended to denigrate playwrights who did not concentrate on representations of psychological depth. Around mid-century, a number of critics and scholars followed Eliot's lead, producing detailed studies of Johnson's verbal style. At the same time, study of Elizabethan themes and conventions, such as those by E. Stoll and M.C. Bradbrook, provided a more vivid sense of how Johnson's work was shaped by the expectations of his time. The proliferation of new critical perspectives after mid-century touched on Johnson inconsistently. Jonas Barish was the leading figure among critics who appreciated Johnson's artistry. On the other hand, Johnson received less attention from the new critics than did some other playwrights, and his work was not of programmatic interest to psychoanalytic critics. But Johnson's career eventually made him a focal point for the revived sociopolitical criticism. Johnson's works, particularly his Masks and Pageants, offer significant information regarding the relations of literary production and political power, as do his contacts with and poems for aristocratic patrons. Moreover, his career at the center of London's emerging literary world has been seen as exemplifying the development of a fully commodified literary culture. In this respect, he is seen as a transitional figure, an author whose skills and ambition led him to a leading role both in the declining culture of patronage and in the rising culture of mass media. Johnson has been called the first poet laureate. 56. If Johnson's reputation as a playwright has traditionally been linked to Shakespeare, his reputation as a poet has, since the early 20th century, been linked to that of John Donne. In this comparison, Johnson represents the cavalier strain of poetry, emphasizing grace and clarity of expression. Donne, by contrast, epitomized the metaphysical school of poetry, with its reliance on strained, baroque metaphors and often vague phrasing. Since the critics who made this comparison, Herbert Grierson for example, were to varying extents rediscovering Donne, this comparison often worked to the detriment of Johnson's reputation. In his time Johnson was at least as influential as Donne. In 1623, historian Edmund Bolton named him the best and most polished English poet. That this judgment was widely shared is indicated by the admitted influence he had on younger poets. The grounds for describing Johnson as the father of Cavalier poets are clear. Many of the Cavalier poets described themselves as his sons, or his tribe. For some of this tribe, the connection was as much social as poetic. Herrick described meetings at the Sun, the Dog, the Triple Tun. 3. All of them, including those like Herrick whose accomplishments in verse are generally regarded as superior to Johnson's, took inspiration from Johnson's revival of classical forms and themes, his subtle melodies, and his disciplined use of wit. In these respects Johnson may be regarded as among the most important figures in the prehistory of English neoclassicism. The best of Johnson's lyrics have remained current since his time. Periodically, they experience a brief vogue, as after the publication of Peter Wally's edition of 1756. Johnson's poetry continues to interest scholars for the light which it sheds on English literary history, such as politics, systems of patronage and intellectual attitudes. For the general reader, Johnson's reputation rests on a few lyrics that, though brief, are surpassed for grace and precision by very few Renaissance poems. On My First Zana, to Celia, to Penshurst, and the epitaph on Solomon Pavey, a boy player abducted from his parents who acted in Johnson's plays. Johnson's productivity began to decline in the 1620s, but he remained well known. In that time, the sons of Ben or the tribe of Ben, those younger poets such as Robert Herrick, Richard Lovelace, and Sir John Suckling who took their bearing in verse from Johnson, rose to prominence. However, a series of setbacks drained his strength and damaged his reputation. He resumed writing regular plays in the 1620s, but these are not considered among his best. They are of significant interest, however, for their portrayal of Charles I's England. The Staple of News, for example, offers a remarkable look at the earliest stage of English journalism. The lukewarm reception given that play was, however, nothing compared to the dismal failure of the new one. The cold reception given this play prompted Johnson to write a poem condemning his audience, an ode to himself, which in turn prompted Thomas Carew, one of the tribe of Ben, to respond in a poem that asks Johnson to recognize his own decline. The principal factor in Johnson's partial eclipse was, however, the death of James and the accession of King Charles I in 1625. Johnson felt neglected by the new court. A decisive quarrel with Jones harmed his career as a writer of court masques, although he continued to entertain the court on an irregular basis. For his part, Charles displayed a certain degree of care for the great poet of his father's day. He increased Jonson's annual pension to £100 and included a tierce of wine and beer. Despite the strokes that he suffered in the 1620s, Jonson continued to write. At his death in 1637 he seems to have been working on another play, The Sad Shepherd. Though only 2 acts are extant, this represents a remarkable new direction for Jonson, a move into pastoral drama. During the early 1630s he also conducted a correspondence with James Howell, who warned him about disfavor at court in the wake of his dispute with Jones. Jonson died on or around the 16th of August 1637, and his funeral was held the next day. It was attended by all or the greatest part of the nobility then in town. 19. He is buried in the north aisle of the nave in Westminster Abbey, with the inscription, O rare Ben Jonson, set in the slab over his grave. John Aubrey, in a more meticulous record than usual, notes that a passer-by, John Young of Great Milton, Oxfordshire, saw the bare grave marker and on impulse paid a workman 18 pence to make the inscription. Another theory suggests that the tribute came from William Davenant, Jonson's successor as poet laureate and card-playing companion of Young, as the same phrase appears on Davenant's nearby gravestone, but essayist Leigh Hunt contends that Davenant's wording represented no more than Young's coinage, cheaply reused. The fact that Jonson was buried in an upright position was an indication of his reduced circumstances at the time of his death. 39. Although it has also been written that he asked for a grave exactly 18 inches square from the monarch and received an upright grave to fit in the requested space. It has been pointed out that the inscription could be read, Orare Ben Jonson, pray for Ben Jonson, possibly in an allusion to Jonson's acceptance of Catholic doctrine during his lifetime. Although he had returned to the Church of England, the carving shows a distinct space between O and rare. A monumento Jonson was erected in about 1723 by the Earl of Oxford and is in the eastern aisle of Westminster Abbey's Poets' Corner. It includes a portrait medallion and the same inscription as on the gravestone. It seems Jonson was to have had a monument erected by subscription soon after his death, but the English Civil War intervened.